Hey Grandmasters, Mike from the WCA. This is our first weekly update of the spring 2016 session. So let's jump right in, okay? I'm playing the white pieces. On Sunday was Sophie, and she's playing against Chris. Chris has started a couple of sections above Sophie, and you may ask, why would I pair them? They were kind of going through something similar as to what section they really belong in when the season starts. And Sophie started playing a little bit over her head and then has managed to fight her way, firmly into the primary section. And Chris has been in championship and has find himself going back and forth. So I like to do that sometimes. I like to put kids who are going through something similar to play each other. The level, is something we can always work out after the game. But it turns out Sophie played him head to head, which was really terrific, and blundered a little later, and I want to talk very specifically about that blunder when we get to it. But anyway, let's take a look. Here's a typical four knights position, and Sophie puts her bishop on b5, and Chris avoids the center fork trick by playing bishop to b4. So I think by now everybody in these classes understands that in a four knights position, which looks like this, where white has already developed the bishop to b5, if black plays bishop to c5, white can go in for this move, knight takes e5, known as the center fork trick. It certainly does not win for white. At first it looks like a blunder because we can just snap off the knight, but there's the fork in the center. Bishop usually goes back to d6. Black likes to keep the bishop, not the knight. Pawn takes knight, bishop takes, and if you count the material, it's equal. And the whole reason for the center fork trick is just to basically knock out black's center pawn, which would leave Sophie with a middle pawn here. It's very powerful. I mean, that pawn is controlling squares, and black doesn't have it. I mean, this bishop here could someday get kicked by a pawn or something. And I say someday because you have to be very careful about moving these center pawns right away. Anyway, from this position, let me just share something with you. I had a kid once in a tournament with white castle, and it was really a good move because his opponent took the knight on c3, thinking that, oh, look at this, I'm just going to destroy white's pawn structure, and I'm going to grab a pawn. That's really not a good idea to do as black. Can you guys figure out why? You can always pause these videos. So if you're watching this on YouTube or, our link, the videos go to YouTube, but whatever viewer that you're watching this on, make sure you know how to pause the video. Not stop it. That may take the visual away. Make sure you can pause it and see the position on the board. Assuming that you have this paused, go through it in your mind why this is not a good idea for black. Black is in big trouble already. Think about it. The king is still in the middle of the board here, and the knight who just snapped off that e pawn. Be very careful. Look at that letter E. Really burn this into your memories that anytime you take an e pawn in a king pawn opening, you're asking for trouble, because if it's a king pawn opening, that means these pawns are out here where I'm toggling the mouse. Well, if you take one of those pawns, you're opening up this file. And that cannot be a good idea with this rook, with the king still there. So I had a student who had this position with white, and he played rook e1, pinning the knight, and black tried to protect it here and with the pawn, and got in huge trouble. This is a pretty high rated tournament player, so I wouldn't expect you guys to always find these kinds of moves. So the most natural thing in the world to do here would be rook taking advantage of this pin that the rook has here by playing the move pawn f3, and that would win the knight back, and you would win material, and you would be in really good shape. But the student played, well, I was very impressed with this, played queen h5 check. So if you remember our saying, always look at every check and capture, all the attacking moves, no matter how silly they look. And this looks like it's a wasted check because black is simply going to just kick the queen, which is what happened in the game, but that's a problem. if you, again, pause the video, moving the queen is not the best option here. I hope you found rook takes pawn, rook takes knight. I mean, it's a crushing move. It's so powerful. You really can't take that rook. What happened in the game was black took, and the reason you can't take is queen e5 check, which hits the king and hits the rook. So if you block with the queen, you're just going to lose that rook, which is, going to be bad for you, obviously. So in the game, king f7, thinking, okay, now my queen protects the rook and everything is fine. It's really not. Not only are you down, well, I don't think you're down material here as black, are you? No, you're not really. But you're in big trouble. How do you get out of this check? If you block with this pawn, you're going to get captured, and you really can't block again with this bishop. I hope you guys can see this. You can go over this slowly. In the game, black put the king on f8 here, and again, you have a free rook here. It looks like a great move, but you also have bishop h6 checkmate. Ouch. So that's just a little something that could come from that center fork trick. So that's kind of cool, right? Anyway, so let's get back to the game. So bishop b5 was played, and Chris says, nah, Sophie, you're not going to get me with the center fork trick, and plays bishop to b4. Okay. She kicks the bishop. He takes the knight, and now we have a choice of which pawn to take back with. The e-pawn here can be captured at any moment, no matter how Sophie takes back. But again, these e-pawns are rarely for free. So she chose the move d takes c3, and in the opening, guys, most of the time, and I hate to say all the time or always in chess because it seems these rules get broken so much. Usually in a chess position, let's go back here, when you get a chance to take with a pawn and bring it closer to the center, you're doing a good thing. So here, if you took the bishop with the b pawn, it would become a c pawn. So that c is closer to d, which is closer to e. So obviously, getting from b to c to d, this pawn is getting closer to the center. However, in the opening phase of the game, we're on move 6 here. Sophie chose what I think is the best option for her, taking with the d pawn, because it opens up a minor piece, opens a line for the queen, and that's really what the opening is about, right? So I love her decision. Now Chris can take a pawn, and I give him a lot of credit. He didn't get to the championship section by taking pawns in the opening with black. Sophie can get it back just very quickly, just put her queen underneath it, and there's all sorts of things that can happen. If you protect the pawn with the d pawn, you'll notice that she can just take the e pawn right away because this bird over here is pinned. I'm not sure why I call people and pieces birds. I have no idea. Maybe I should think about that, but I do. Anyway, let's go back. So after queen e2, another way to get out of trouble is just retreat the knight, and then Sophie does to Chris what Chris did to Sophie. She just takes his knight, and when he recaptures toward the center, you take back with the queen. Now, the reason I like this game so much is it reminded me of a lot of types of positions I've seen in Scholastic chess. And here, typically, this happens a lot where you take each other's knights on these squares, the e-pawns disappear, both kings are still in the middle, and a queen is checking a king. It's a very common position in chess, especially with young players. This kind of stuff happens all the time. If you block with the queen, you could take right away and have a fine position as white, because the pawn structure is basically symmetrical, and the pieces are pretty much the same, except for the fact that the bishops are of opposite color, which the higher you get, we can start talking about playing with bishops that are on two different colors. But here, try not to get in the habit of always making that first capture. You can develop another piece here and protect. And then if the queen is captured, you can just take back with the bishop. And your bishop is in the game, your bishop is pointing at a pawn here, and you have a really nice situation going on because if black continues, say this looks like a terrific move. So each bishop is threatening to destroy the other person's pawn structure. And I like when kids get in the habit of just ignoring that sometimes and trading their structure for something else. You know, let's take a look at what I mean. So instead of worrying about the pawn structure, let's trade that for development. So we castle the king, and at the same time, doesn't that activate our rook over here? I think it does. If we go back before that move, the rook in the corner, this guy over here, like, I don't really think you want to put him on a2. It is a gorgeous diagonal, but as far as I know, rooks don't move on diagonals. So do they? No, they don't. So I like trading sometimes structure. So again, here we go. Black says, oh, thank you very much. I've destroyed your pawn structure. And after I do that, I can castle. But here, white can just return the favor. But there is a difference. Because white castled before, they're one step closer to the center with the rook than black was. So from here, you might give a check. Not just to say check, but you knock the king into the corner. And when he's in the corner here, then you can follow up with, say, a move like rook d7. And I highlighted those rooks just to show you there is a small advantage for white here. Is white winning? I can't say that white is winning the game, but I think I'd rather be white because both rooks are more active than black's rooks. And that's pretty much all there is on the board. There are no bishops. There are no knights. Each team has a broken pawn structure, but the difference is, how did white get to this position? By not being the first one to trade. So this kind of thing happens way back here. You see the bishop attacking the knight? So rather than worrying about that pawn structure being broken, castle, and then if they take, we have this position, and then if black decides to castle, now you go in for the trade of minor pieces, give a check with the rook, king in the corner, and then put your rook on d7. And again, one more time, just compare the rooks, okay? All right, now let's go back to the game. Goodness gracious, where were we? I have no idea. Now I remember. Okay, so anyway, back here. So Sophie just took back on c3. I'm getting old. I'm going to be 103 next month. Sophie just took back on c3, and Chris, he's been around. He's got a lot of experience. He's not interested in this pawn, so he just castles. And now at this point, Sophie has to start being careful about this pawn, and she protects it tactically. She plays bishop to h6, great move, so I don't think the knight's going anywhere soon. Chris doesn't like the fact that the bishop is pointing at her knight, and then Sophie says, I'm not running away so fast. Let me just back up to h4 and see what you want to do. So Chris calmly develops another piece, so the light square bishop is coming in the game. Very well played game, by the way, really well played. Queen to d2, and this gives her an option now of castling on either side. And I don't know if she knew this idea or not. Let me just highlight this pawn structure for a moment. You see that structure here? This is another common idea that happens in chess whenever a d pawn takes away from the center. Again, it weakens the middle a little bit, but it also gives the king an option of castling queenside, where he will have an extra pawn protecting him. Okay? So after queen d2, Chris attacks the bishop, and here Sophie had an option. She could have dropped this bishop back to protect that e pawn, and then say a move like queen e7, and now she can castle long. But what she decided to do was take the knight, take back, and now castle. So the only question would be whether or not Chris could make anything of this open or half-open b file. Okay, but I love the way she's playing so far. Both of them. This is a really well-played game. Now, there's one of those free pawns, because the knight takes the pawn, and you're thinking, well, I thought that knight could move. Look at that. The queen is being attacked. That's true. The problem is when Chris takes the pawn, here he's also attacking Sophie's queen. Now, again, let's go back. Here is another typical idea in Scholastic tournaments. What about pawn g5? That looks like a clever way to win this pawn for free, because if this bishop moves away, say here, now it looks like we can pick off a pawn, hit the queen, hit the bishop, and that looks pretty good for us, right? Well, don't always play the first move that you see. Let's go back to this g5 idea. What if you actually said to yourself, okay, I'll take the pawn. So you renew the pin to the knight and the queen here, and then black might as well take. And now you take the pawn with your queen, and you have two pawns. So two pawns, say king h7, and one little trick sometimes is you may want to avoid this rook hitting your queen someday. So what some players do is they go through like a little dance. They'll give another check, the king will go to g8, and then at some point they can take a third pawn. So you see with the queen on the h file here, there's no rook to attack the queen. And then you take this pawn here on e5, and how do we get away with that? Look at the lines that I drew. This d pawn here is, oops, I didn't mean to do that, sorry. Let's go back. The d pawn here is pinned. You can't take the knight because of this rook, and pay very close attention to this idea. You see that? That rook can come up and over at the same time. So that's that would be really useful, and that's a cool position. You have three pawns for the piece, and the black king is open. Is Chris lost here? I have no idea. He has to defend this, and Sophie has to find these ideas, but keep that in mind. Just because somebody breaks a pin with a move like g5, now you know a trick. Now you can take it, and if you can get two pawns for the piece and an attack, and then eventually a third pawn, then I would recommend going for it. I mean, you'll have a lot of fun too. Okay, so anyway, I like Chris's move. He's like, no way, let's just go for this crazy trading idea. And Sophie plays correctly. She takes the queen. So Chris better take hers. And then both minor pieces are hanging, the knight and the bishop. So Sophie says, let me grab a pawn before I take your knight. And Chris says, let me take your knight. Okay, that breaks Sophie's pawn structure. But the problem for Chris is there's a pawn hanging here that can't be defended. You can't bring a rook over here because the bishop will take. So she's going to get her pawn and end up being up a pawn in this position. So Chris pushed the pawn, and what she should have done here is just take the pawn on e5. This position, even though white is up a pawn, or she should be, yes she is not that easy to win. We're not going to do that in this video because it's bishops of opposite color would be the main problem for a master in this position. However, I think most of us would definitely take the white pieces. But to Chris's credit, after Sophie attacked his rook, he just said, nope, let me get out of the way. And then Sophie starts attacking that pawn. He lifts his rook, and here she takes the pawn. Chris, in this position, could probably just play back here, can probably just play f6 and guard that pawn and have a pretty good position here. And then instead attacks her bishop. She now takes. He connects his rooks, or at least gets the rook ready to support his friend. Love Sophie's move, threatening to win a pawn up here, and then this is where the game ends. Very, very instructive up to this point. Here, the problem is there's going to be so much pressure on this line, but after the move f6, this is what Sophie had in her mind. There's a pin. This pawn is pinned, so she just grabbed this here. And she ended up losing the game because she missed the fact that, can you guys see it? Yeah, the rook can just slide over here. So, had she grabbed the pawn much earlier, she would have had a great position. But as it turns out, she made that typical mistake in the primary level. She's getting good enough to understand and see the pins, but she forgets that just because the pawn is pinned in this position, there was another way to take back, and she ended up getting a losing position. Although, you know, later in the game, she did have a couple of extra pawns, but we're not going to get into that now. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the game. It was very, very instructive. I may actually put 2 up for the 12 and 2 o'clock class. Okay, folks, we'll see you Sunday.